Hey folks, welcome back to the DarkHorse Podcast live stream 123 Q&A segment.
Indeed. We're gonna make it a little brief this week because we have some things we need to be doing.
Yeah.
That are not right here.
Late for a very important date.
Something like that. And we are bringing to you today the left haunch of our favorite epic tabby. Okay. From the Discord this week, they had a tie, and I was thinking actually we might take a stab at both of their questions because they're both really good.
They had a tie, though it wasn't required.
They vote in the Discord server every week on which question they most want us to answer, and they're both very good. So, doesn't it make sense to leave God, or a conscious creator, on the table as a fair hypothesis, rather than assuming that it is factually incorrect but metaphorically true? Is it possible that our ability to falsify or not has simply not matured enough, and we should keep trying? The meta-analysis sure seems compelling, and even Einstein had a go at it and couldn't falsify.
Great question. Mm-hmm. No, it does not. And the reason is because the underlying principle that allows us to make sense of the universe, and all the philosophers are going to jump out of their chairs and shout at the screen, but is Occam's razor, the principle of parsimony, which is to say, you do not want more complexity in your explanations than is necessary. That is to say, the explanation that, I'm going to say this carefully so that I believe it is ironclad. Given all of the evidence, the explanation that explains most while assuming least is correct. Absent all of the evidence, it tends to be correct. So that is where we are. We lack a bunch of evidence. We can't observe everything. But here's the problem with leaving the idea of a creator. And the idea of a creator is formally left on the table. We could be living in a simulation, in which case we would have creators who had designed the universe. We would be in it. But
I guess that framing of Occam's razor suggests, given that we know that we don't have all the information, that while Occam's razor strongly leads to the conclusion that there is no additional complexifying thing in the universe that we might call a god or another creator, I actually am not sure how the way that you invoked Occam's razor doesn't lead us to leaving open the possibilities of fair hypothesis.
Oh, it is open as a possibility, but it does not require falsification for the following reason.
But the question is, doesn't it make sense to leave it on the table as a fair hypothesis? And you said no.
Because I take that to mean a hypothesis in need of falsification, which it is not. It could be true. We could have, if we are living in a simulation, which we would not be in a position to detect, we would have a creator, and it would look to us like a universe without a creator, and yet there would be, there's a dude with a clipboard taking notes on what we do here in the simulation, and he's got his own purposes, I suppose. So it is open, it could be, but we assume it to be false because it doesn't buy you any new explanatory power, and it increases the assumptions dramatically. So that is to say, if there is, let's say, okay, they've got it right. We have a creator. The creator built the simulation, which is the universe as far as we experience it. So it's just not even a stretch, right? Actually, somebody had a purpose and they made this thing and we live in it, and that's our universe. Okay? Where'd that come from? Oh, well, they live in a simulation too. Somebody made their universe, right? At some point, you're going to run into a universe that wasn't made by somebody. And then the point is, oh, well, what process created that critter? Oh, it's going to be an evolutionary process. And so the point is, you've got evolutionary process creates a being.
That's the answer.
Right. Evolutionary process creates a being that can make stuff. And then those beings that make stuff. And yes, we could have one of those who made us. Seems really unlikely. But the point is, you're already taking all of the assumptions behind evolution and automatically accepting them, and then adding another one, which is a creator of this universe, which is just more complex, and it buys you nothing new.
Yeah. I mean, I actually like the way that went, because I don't think that the original answer, which involved a very careful framing of Occam's razor, gets you to be able to say no here. But an explanation of what invoking a creator does for the logical chain of falsification does get you to an answer.
Yep. All right. So
that's it.
Well, maybe there was more to the question, but my sense is it could be that we have a creator. That's a real live possibility from the point of view of simulation, which I think is the only way it could really be. But maybe I'm just a limited person. And
well, now it seems like you're going. So I mean, this is a little. Go on. I feel like you're kind of taking like all the sides.
I'm being perfectly consistent. We could have a creator. I don't see any reason to imagine that we do, and I don't think the hypothesis requires falsification. In the absence of evidence that we do, we should assume it false. The reason we should assume it false is it doesn't explain anything. That it adds assumptions and explains nothing new, right? In other words, if you're going to accept that evolution creates very, very powerful creatures, then you've accepted evolution as a creative force capable of creating what we see here in the universe that's so darn hard to explain. And so the point is, the one thing we have found which points us in the direction of correct explanations, which is that they tend to assume less or explain more or both, that thing does not suggest that this hypothesis deserves our attention.
Yeah. Okay. I feel like we'll just leave it there for now. Next question. Also from Discord this week, which was in a tie with the last one. Do you know why we have double organs in our bodies, such as 2 kidneys? Is there any explanation for that, like evolutionary malfunction? And why not more than 2? It looks like we are limited in 2 for some reason.
Yeah, that's a good question. Here's one thing I would want to know. You're going to know more about the doubling of these organs. And we talked a little bit last week about the doubling of the thyroid in the cat, where ours is fused. But
that's right.
But
not fused. Fused.
I think it is fused.
Yeah, actually.
Yeah.
Is that right?
But here's the question. An ancestor who lost a kidney, if a kidney died from an infection or something. Do they survive that? Do they have is it like an arm where you've got a programming for if that thing gets broken, here's how you stay alive to the point that you can contribute positively to your fitness thereafter? Or is the ability to remove a kidney a medical fact that has no meaning evolutionarily, like the ability to correct the the encephalitic babies, the ability to correct the the water on the brain problem, and rescue them from something that would have killed any ancestor?
Oh, are you asking me?
I don't know if you know.
I'm sorry. I was thinking. Ask it again. Then I didn't take that as. I thought you were going rhetorical, and we're going somewhere, and I have something else to say.
The kidney, the doubled kidney.
Yeah.
It means something different if no ancestor would have ended up losing a kidney and having a backup, and that was meaningful. If you die because your kidney kills you as it fails, except for the fact of a surgeon taking it out, then the doubling means something very different than it's a backup and a certain number of ancestors lost one kidney.
I believe, but I've got a lot of comparative anatomy background, but no explicitly medical background, that kidneys can and do fail. Sometimes they can fail spectacularly and take out the individual, even if it's just one kidney. Of course, that's going to be able to happen, but that they can fail sort of silently, leaving you with one functioning kidney. So what I was thinking when I thought you were speaking rhetorically was, we obviously there are lots of things about which we do have many, right? Like, why not more than 2? Well, we have more than 2 white blood cells, right? We have lots of things, and maybe you will say, well, that's just because it moves around. We don't we are bilaterally symmetrical. And therefore, we tend to have paired things to some degree, and that allows for things like binocular vision and stereo sound, and even we can triangulate with smells. Not us so well because we're primates, but the bilateral symmetry allows for a doubling of sense organs, which allows us to better place things in space.
Yep.
The doubling of something like a kidney. Potentially, I'm thinking about like a kidney and a liver. So we have one liver, but it's got lots of lobes, and it's not discrete in the same way. Your liver doesn't fail and you're done, right?
Yep.
Your liver gets cirrhosis and you have parts of it that are not working very well. And sometimes autopsies reveal like, wow, that's the thing. Finally, after, 40 years of hard drinking or whatever it is, the liver failed. But you don't have the liver fail early on in an acute incident, often in the same way. And what are the liver and the kidneys? They are detoxifying organs, right? And of course, also in terms of the kidneys, they're concentrating organs. So you would expect them to have specific ability to deal with insult and injury and have the organism go on. In the case of kidney, it seems to be about doubling.
I will explain in a second. Keep going.
Okay. It's hard to talk while you're doing that.
I'm trying to get it to stop.
And the kidneys being doubled and the liver being having lots of lobes and having not tending to fail early in the same way are different responses to a similar problem that they both deal with. What else do we have? We have one heart, but we have two systems. That's different. The systemic and the pulmonary. We have two lungs. I think the answer to why two lungs is not exactly going to be about it being paired, because at least in mammals, which have the diagnostic characteristic of the diaphragm, which is the transverse, that's actually down here, the transverse septum that separates the cardiac and pleural cavities from the all the rest of the stuff in the coelom, in the gut cavity, becomes muscularized in mammals and becomes the diaphragm and enables us as mammals to basically engage in active muscularized breathing. So lungs, and so our lungs tend to work in tandem. I don't know.
In that case, I think it's just that.
I think that's going to be just an artifact.
Two in order to call it a pleural cavity. Oh God, that was a terrible, terrible pun.
Spelled differently.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Well, that's all right. I'm
I
fine with
know.
that.
You don't care. You don't care, and it's actually spelled more similarly than it might be, but it's just an extra E in there.
Yeah. No. So all right, we've got various hypotheses on the table. You can have some doubling as a matter of redundancy, which may well be the case in the kidney. You've got another mechanism for doing that in the liver, where you have multiple lobes.
Yep.
And my guess
and they're not exactly symmetric. But
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
But I would guess in the case of the lungs that it is also a redundancy issue. Not that an ancestor would likely lose a lung and survive to contribute positively to their fitness, but that if you're going to get a pneumonia, it's better to get it on one side and have it largely isolated from the other.
Yes, that's true.
So that there's damage that you would want one lung can keep you alive while the other lung is fixing itself.
And of course, the reproductive system is largely duplicated too, with the exception of the actual genitals.
Yep.
And actually, monotremes have Y-shaped penises and vaginas.
They do.
So they have a little doubling there too, which is odd. And then squamates, snakes and penises, actually have two. They have hemipenes.
You said snakes and penises. It's not a thing. It's not even a Freudian slip. That's just weird.
Yeah, snakes, penises have shared lizards.
Yeah.
Squamates, snakes and lizards have hemipenes.
They do. And you got to ask yourself, so I do happen to have a story about this, oddly enough.
About snakes and penises?
No, lizards, in fact.
Okay.
Years ago when I was working...
Which snakes are.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
When I was working with Bob Trivers, my first research gig was in Jamaica, as you know, and I was trying to come to understand these lizards. And one of the things he suggested was you should do a 24-hour focal watch, follow one animal for 24 hours, see everything it does. You'd be surprised what you learn. And I must tell you, it was a truly exhausting and frustrating experience at times, but it was super educational as a biologist just to have a single day of this one animal.
Yes. Oh my God, it's so powerful. And also long stretches of boredom.
Oh, so much.
Right?
But then a surprising amount of excitement, actually.
Sure.
So this blue anole, one of the many species, I know they're not called anoles anymore. Norops.
Yep.
The blue one on Jamaica, which is one of 5 or 6 native species.
Yeah.
It's a large animal. I was following a male. He's got a dewlap.
I think the ones in Jamaica have been renamed Norops. I'm not actually positive because Enola still exists. Anyway,
yeah. Whatever it is, the large Jamaican blue lizard.
Yeah.
This animal had sex 3 times.
There's a male.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And he alternated sides.
Yeah.
Right? So it could be that one side gets exhausted, the other side takes over. And so it's a...
Different females? 3 different females?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if that's the situation or if there's a hazard and sometimes an animal loses one of them and uses the other. Anyway, but it was interesting that in that case, alternating sides was a real phenomenon.
Yeah. Okay, maybe we've done enough on that. The snakes and penises question. God,
you're never gonna live it down.
Good, that's fine. If that's the error that
the
follows me, that's good. I'm fine with that. Okay. Celibate clergy as a benevolent lineage counselor. Isn't what the status of menopause is ancestrally supposed to achieve? Has the patriarchy taken over that traditional female role?
All right.
This is from Echo.
Somebody's paying attention. Not surprising that it would be Echo.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. Not exactly, but you're on the right track.
Great question. Let's just say it again because I was sort of stumbling and you want to just frame the question again?
So the idea here is that I believe Echo's probably following something I said, or maybe I don't know if we put it in the book. But anyway, the idea is that a clergy is in a great position to speak for the lineage, to steer the lineage out of danger and into opportunity. And that a celibate clergy is especially good at this because the celibate clergy, especially a celibate clergy that's taken a vow of poverty or something like it, does not have a conflict of interest. That is to say, the priest is not hopefully leaving offspring all over town and getting rich and gambling or buying yachts or whatever he might do. If he is limited to, an ascetic life and one that is not directly reproductive and one that is not highly profitable, then he's in a great position not to be corrupted by those things and to say, oh, I think we're headed in a bad direction with that outbreak of whatever kind of behavior is happening in the congregation, right? So, okay, speaks for lineage because his direct opportunity to reproduce or profit is eliminated. Females at hitting menopause are altered in this direction. And in fact, there's lots of stuff. Dick Alexander, my PhD advisor, used to talk about the change in women's perspective at menopause. He talked about the change in their humor also at menopause. Interesting stuff. Change in the way they laugh, he said. But anyway, the point is, when a woman is no longer in a position to leave offspring directly, then it is natural for her sense of what to do in the world to default to a larger set. But that set is not exactly lineage in the same sense that a clergy member who may be, the authority for the town is. Her ability to positively affect her fitness going forward is much more likely to default to her brood, right? That is to say, all the offspring she has produced and all the grand offspring that may have been produced by them. And that is not distinct from lineage. It is a lineage, but it is narrower. So what I would say is, I think you've got exactly the right theme. And as I keep saying to people, the beauty of the idea of lineage is that it's fractal, right? So you can say that a woman on hitting menopause is going to default to a lineage orientation, and that clergy members speak for a lineage orientation, but the meaning of the term lineage is at a different scale typically. Something like that.
Cool. I have heard that blondes are about 2% of the world population and redheads are going extinct. Will we all eventually have black hair? What is different hair color about anyway?
Well, I would say there's a couple things.
I wonder about the numbers.
Yeah.
And I wonder why redheads would be going extinct. I think
a bunch of things need to be on the table.
Cool.
One, the meaning of these things is going to be very different in an ancient world where these traits initially arose, right?
For at least 2 reasons.
Okay, let me make sure I got them both. Oh, yeah. Okay.
Are we going to share them?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's see if I've got the same 2 as you.
Awesome.
Could be 3.
Yeah.
Could be 4.
Could
if
be
we've
4.
each got 2.
Yeah.
One is that you would tend to have been inside a population that would probably have a hair color, and that a lot of what we're seeing now is the intermingling of populations where you get every intermediate variant and you get a lot of shuffling of geographic location.
That's related to one of mine, but not exactly. So, okay. Yep.
And then the other one is going to be people who are trans hair color go to the market and get something and alter their hair color because they were, they were born into the head of
wrong hair.
Yeah, they were born into the wrong hair. Exactly.
Oh, this is good. Yeah. So we basically had the same 2. I guess I was framing the first one more as, and this is sort of related to what is different hair color about anyway. That many people in the world, not all by any means, and in fact, the not all are much more likely to be within equatorial regions who are much more likely to have black hair, or darker hair at least. People do not live where their ancestors lived anymore and travel lots of places. And so, blondness shows up many places where blondness never would have shown up before.
Yeah.
So, blondness evolves closer to the poles and precisely closer to the North Pole because that's where most of the landmass, there's much more land on Earth and therefore people on Earth closer to the North Pole than closer to the South Pole. And blonde people have certainly, populated out various places, but I'm not sure exactly where I was going with that.
Well, let's just say blondness tends to evolve near the poles, but the poles tend to be brown-haired. They're brunettes.
I see. Are they?
I think so.
I don't know if they are, actually. I don't have an image of sort of the stereotypical Polish person in my head. And then, gosh, I don't know. Redheadedness. Irish? Right? But where else? I don't know. I don't know what the redhead thing is about with regard, if we're not talking about comes from a bottle,
right,
which is the silly shorthand, but if it's what you're born with, so blondness in part, presumably in part, is basically allowing you to do some vitamin D synthesis through your scalp. Mm-hmm. Right, that if you are, just as people have darker skin near the equator, which if their ancestors were more recently nearer to the equator, they are more likely to have darker skin and darker hair, which is protection against the harmful rays of the sun. But it also, the flip side of that is that they would have to spend a lot more time in the sun in order to generate sufficient amounts of vitamin D, which is part of why people who were more recently from equatorial regions who moved to temperate and even Arctic regions are much more likely to be vitamin D deficient than people moving the other direction. Swedish people moving to the tropics are going to need to worry about sunburn quite a lot, but are unlikely to need to worry about vitamin D synthesis if they spend any time outside at all, because between the sun being able to reach through their hair into their scalp and also all of that pale skin, vitamin D synthesis is relatively easy, with all the other caveats about age makes you less efficient at vitamin D synthesis, being overweight does, a variety of autoimmune disorders and some other medical conditions do as well.
Living in your mother's basement will do it.
Living in your mother's basement makes it very hard to synthesize vitamin D.
Yes,
indeed.
Especially if she has glass in the windows in her basement that just barely peek over the pavement outside.
In which case you should really talk to her about that.
Yeah, you might want to mention it.
Or just talk to her or anyone, really.
Right. Yeah. Talk to her outside. Just so you
exactly. Just have a conversation. Maybe work for some coffee.
It's gotten ridiculous very quickly. But yeah. I do want to point out a couple things. One, hair itself is a bit of a weird phenomenon in persons. Didn't come out as good as I was hoping. In people, let's just say. Yeah. Because the thing is that the distinction between hair and fur, right? The cat, here.
You gonna do it?
Yeah, I will show you. See, this is the cat. The cat has what is commonly referred to as fur, which basically is a hair of fixed length. It grows and then it stops growing. And hair doesn't stop growing, which raises all kinds of questions about the ancestors. But the point is, why did we lose so much of what was presumably fur at one point? And why did we end up with hair instead? And why on the top of our heads? And why?
And why is none of our hair a goatee?
Right, exactly.
I mean, the tabby thing is, this is completely irrelevant to the question, but the tabby thing is, we won't be able to show this, but if you have a tabby at home, you should try this at home. Just look at his haunches, or her haunches, as the case may be, and see how individual furs actually have 3, or in some cases 4 distinct colors. When an individual fur has basically striations, you end up with this tabby, this sort of mottled look. And while individual hairs can occasionally, on humans, can switch color midway, that's rare.
It's
and that
rare.
Seems to be about like a stress event often.
Right.
And that hair went gray.
Yep.
Yeah.
So obviously in the case of fur, which has this agouti banding issue, it's obviously a matter of timing. That the follicle basically puts out a different color at different points, and it knows how far it is along the individual hair. But anyway, point is, hair is itself a bit of a weird thing in that we have it on the top of our heads. I don't know that I've heard a great explanation of why a creature that lost fur ended up with hair on the top of its heads. Maybe somebody's figured it out.
Yeah, there's one anthropological hypothesis, which I'm not sure I buy, which involves, going bipedal at the moment that you're also, basically going bipedal means that now you don't need as much of the fur to protect yourself from the potentially burning rays of the sun, but why not keep it on the part of your head that is most exposed to the sun? That assumes it's always right overhead. Yeah, I'm not sure I buy this. Yeah. Exactly.
I don't know. I mean, I've had that thought, but it just doesn't have the sense of like, oh yeah, that explains it.
I agree.
But anyway, okay. So other interesting facts that are relevant here. A place that we have gone somewhat frequently, San Juan Island, has foxes. I'm going to tell you the story of the foxes because it's weird and fascinating. The foxes were introduced to San Juan Island, which does not natively have foxes. The foxes that were introduced are red foxes. The foxes were introduced to control the rabbits. The rabbits were introduced to feed the lighthouse keeper, which I think is actually, it's sort of, it is backwards ecologically, right? As ecologically sensitive people, the idea of introducing a species to feed the lighthouse keeper isn't how you would want it done. On the other hand, how great a plan is that you take a rapidly reproducing herbivore, you introduce it, it spreads like wildfire.
It spreads like rabbits.
It does spread like rabbits, and then you hunt them as needed for sustenance, and then they get out of control, and then you introduce the foxes. But why do I tell you this? Hey, Zach? Yeah. Actually, Heather, you could do it. You want to get a picture of one of the melanistic foxes from San Juan Island? They're not too hard to come by.
You just keep on.
So the thing is, on San Juan Island, these foxes have been there, it's not 200 years, it's more like 100 years.
You want...
yeah, any one of those...
That's one with both.
Oh, okay, that'll work.
Yeah.
Okay, so here we have a picture of a red fox and a black silver-tipped fox. And the point that I wanted to make...
The black one's being called melanistic, the same root as melanin. Yep.
Yep. The point I wanted to make is that the evolutionary change in coloration, because we know when this population started, I don't happen to know offhand, but it wasn't a very long time.
Yeah.
It's some radically powerful kind of selection did this, and or the system inside the fox is built to detect some kind of selective pressure and respond to it very rapidly. Nonetheless,
and yet both morphs do persist on San Juan Island.
Absolutely, they do. And I would guess that that's fox kits eating a rabbit. I think that might be their mother and their three animal. But
yeah.
Anyway, the point is that, especially with respect to sexual selection, it would not be surprising if markers that indicated something in some reliable way emerged. And, how would you get selection to change the color of a fox population? Well, it might be that females facing an interesting puzzle, like this is not a very big gene pool, and therefore we've got problems with deleterious recessive genes in a way that the mainland population doesn't. They might select for males that have an indicator that they're from a population that didn't have such a big problem with that, which could come in the form of color, which would then predict over time that the strange melanism would disappear, right? That it's a solution to a temporary problem. I also believe that the same phenomenon, not on San Juan Island, but in other places, has rapidly produced black squirrels. So my guess would be that there's some sort of a mechanism whereby it's an honest indicator of probably a genetic state that is relevant to sexual selection, and that's why you end up seeing it. So my point is, in the context of humans, you can have functional differences, but you might also have signaling differences, and it would have to be an honest indicator. I think it would have to be an honest indicator in order for selection to favor its elaboration. In other words, females who chose on the basis of such a characteristic and came out ahead would therefore cause that characteristic to be elaborated.
Yeah. I guess this is not directly relevant to what you're saying, but I'm just thinking like the origins of blondes and redheads, I think in both cases, it's North Atlantic and Scandinavia. Because their Vikings have been redheaded as well. And so it's like actually both of those are coming from the same place. I don't think you have, aside from sort of albinism, which is a complete lack of pigment, but I don't think you have blondes or redheads natively in the Americas, in Africa, in Asia, in Australia, and not even in Southern Europe. I think it's coming out of Northern Europe and North Atlantic.
Well,
I may be wrong.
No,
but I think that's right.
I like it, and I guess one thing I'm thinking is there might be a distinction between a population sandwiched between two other populations and a population with humans on one edge and not the other. That an edge population might have different selective forces on it.
Edge or island, yeah.
Yep.
All edge. Yep. Cool. Each generation since World War II has gotten increasingly childish and arrested in development. Puberty blockers seem to be a case of us manifesting that into existence now as the next phase. Can this make sense evolutionarily?
I know you are, but what am I? I was just being childish. I don't know. I got the gist of the question. We're seeing an infantilization, an accelerating infantilization, and then what was the?
Can this make sense evolutionarily? It's like puberty blockers seem to be a case of us manifesting that into existence now as the next phase. I guess I don't feel like that's. I feel like that's not quite the way it works, but I'm not sure that there's a way it works that's been proposed exactly.
So I think the answer to the question is neoteny can make sense in some cases, but progressive, like a regression, doesn't likely make sense.
So neoteny is a very precise version of the larger thing, which is pedomorphosis, which is retains juvenile characteristics as an adult reproductive form.
Pedomorphosis is what I mean.
Yeah. I'm just defining terms here.
Yep.
It's been proposed and taken seriously in some quarters that's what humans are. Humans are the pedomorphic ape, that we retain juvenile characteristics, that our heads are bigger than you would expect, our eyes are bigger than you would expect. Maybe we say things like, I know you are, but what am I, more than you would expect for another linguistic ape.
I have said it more than you would expect in my adult life, which is to say once.
Once, yes. And I've never been really compelled by this hypothesis, but what you were saying was that pedomorphosis as this known evolutionary thing in which, for instance, let me just take it out of humans for the moment, some salamanders, so salamanders are amphibians, amphibians, amphibios, can live well in both water and land, but generally at different life stages, Typically, we find aquatic eggs and larval forms that metamorphose into terrestrial forms. There are some circumstances in which you would either want the possibility and so be facultatively metamorphic, like do I metamorphose or do I retain my larval form even as my gonads develop? Or circumstances in which actually all of us are going to stick in the water, so we're going to become obligate pedomorphs. We're never going to metamorphose. There's salamanders, therefore, that do not lose their tail fins and the webbing between their toes and their gills, for instance, and a bunch of other internal stuff that allows them, they don't develop lungs, for instance, the way they would if they were metamorphic. Humans obviously don't go through this kind of metamorphosis at all, but are we pedomorphic? Not really.
Yeah. I would point out, though, there is an interesting case here in the Pacific Northwest of a salamander that is pedomorphic behaviorally and facultatively without being morphologically pedomorphic, which begins to say something about this human case.
What are you talking about?
I am talking about the rough-skinned newt. That the males in many populations do not leave the water.
Yeah.
So
they do. So they don't. It's interesting. They've got some pedomorphic traits and some not. They do not, I don't think, retain the external gills.
They don't.
They have lungs.
Yep.
But external morphologically, they do retain a tail fin and some webbing. So they're good at swimming. They're good at moving through water.
Yep.
Better at moving through water than they would be if they had fully transformed in a terrestrial form. But the really important stuff around respiration did go pedomorphic in them.
Yep.
Yeah.
So anyway, behavioral pedomorphosis is a real thing, but I think the person asking the question, the answer is my instinct, and I think your instinct is no, this is not an adaptation. Humans getting less and less mature. It is the result of hypernovelty disrupting a developmental process, and it ain't good for us. And let's cut it out before we do something stupid and go extinct.
Indeed. So that's maybe kind of sort of related to this next question, which claims humans will eventually have the technology to change sex as easily, safely, cheaply, and reversibly as we change clothes. That day is not today and could be 200 years from now. But how do we ethically bridge that gap, given that it necessarily involves experimentation on kids and many failed cases will fall into the uncanny valley?
Ain't never going to happen, is my feeling.
Yeah, I think I knew that. I knew that I did, and was almost certain that you would reject the assumption of the question, which is in the first sentence. The first sentence being, again, humans will eventually have the technology to change sex as easily, safely, cheaply, and reversibly as we change clothes. Frankly, it's easy to say no way when you add reversibly as we change clothes there. Is it barely within the realm of possibility that we could have the capacity to change all of the systems once and only once, thus making a human a single individual human, an actual one-time functional hermaphrodite? I don't think so. But that's at least something that we could talk about with regard to the complexity of the systems and all of this. But the idea of kind of going back and forth and actually being functional as the other sex, it's just too much. There's just no way.
Yeah, I don't think. I think it is barely plausible that in a small number of cells you could make an alteration that would cause an individual to go down the alternative pathway. It would be irreversible, and it would be pointless to do it in a small number of cells. You might as well do it at the at the zygote. So you have a single cell.
And this this is the point, actually, right? Like, we talk about sexual development, right? Mm-hmm. It's not a toggle. It's not like there are two states, and so the states are binary, and we think of zeros and ones, and like, oh, just make the 0 or 1, just make the 1 a 0. Like, no, it takes years. It takes years, and no, we're not a metamorphic species, but we do go through puberty, which is a kind of like metamorphosis light. And so you can't just say, turn those, I don't even know what the analogies are. I know we know them, they're the homologs, but like turn the female reproductive structures into male ones. Like it can't work that way. And so, the only thing that I see here as a remote possibility, and why would you ever, is could we develop the technology to turn, for instance, an XX embryo into a functional male adult, into someone that developed through puberty as male into a functional male adult? Maybe, but that would, like, why?
Right.
Like, why would you do that?
Good pun.
Right. Why? Yes, why would you do that? And anything that starts later or imagines that you could do it multiple times, or forgets that it's not just the reproductive, it's not just the primary sex characteristics, right? There is masculinization or feminization of the brain, of the endocrine system. And there are, with regard to endocrinology, there are effects of hormones, especially the steroid hormones, especially the sex hormones, like the androgens, testosterone, androstenedione, like the estrogens and progesterone, which have not just activational effects, which is to say, turn it on, now get, a rush of energy. I don't know. But also organizational effects, which is to say, when you have those hormones in development, they organize your system so that those systems then follow different pathways. You become canalized. And those developmental systems can't just suddenly become other things. They would have to go through a whole other developmental process in order to be so.
So it strikes me, in thinking about this in this context, that this has a lot to do with actually the last question about immaturity. And the point is, everything that we perceive is inherently, the reason that we bother perceiving it, the reason that we bother thinking about it, is about the future. You may be dwelling on the past, but you're dwelling on the past because the past has some implication that is worth spending your effort on. The past cannot be changed. And this is like an obsession with changing the past, right? The idea of, I was born in the wrong body, is instead of saying, well, okay, here are the cards I was dealt. Maybe you're a woman with a very masculine orientation to the world. Okay, what are you going to make of that? The answer is you can make a lot of that, right? You are such a woman, right? Or you could lament the fact that something and something else don't fit together in the way that somebody told you they were supposed to. And then, you can rail against the cursed biology and try to go back and unbiology it. And, it's like, okay, A, it's not liable to work all that well. And B, it's a misorientation. The point is, look, if you walk out into the street and you get hit by a bus and you lose your arm, yep, you're going to end up grieving your arm. But at some point, and it's going to be the best moment of your life going forward, you're going to move on. Right? You're going to say, well, I am a person with one arm. Yep. And
let's live my best life with one arm.
Because it's about the future. Irrespective of whether you got, you may have gotten hit by a drunk driver and you lost your arm. Is it okay to be mad? Yes, but the point is, if what you are is mad from then on, then you won't do any of the things that you might do even with just the one arm.
Right. Great. I think there's a typo in this question. What it says is, are individuals able to evolve resistance to iocane powder? Which, if I change that I to a C, it's cocaine.
No,
is iocane a thing?
It is a thing, but I don't remember what kind of a thing it is.
Zach, do you know what iocane is? Okay. Zach's going to look it up, and we'll move on, and then we'll come back. Okay, what is it? Okay, well, you figure it out and then get back to us, and we are going to move on to the next question, okay? Oh, okay. I don't. Well then, Glendon, whose last name, which is presumably a nom de plume, a pseudonym I have never known how to pronounce, we can't answer it because unfortunately it's been a couple years since we've seen Princess Bride. I don't remember iocane powder.
Yeah, I sort of do.
What does it do? It's just poison?
Is it the one where they have the battle over which cup it's in? It's that one, yes.
Oh, actually, I can hear the guy's voice now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep, that's the one. What was the question in light of?
Are individuals able to evolve resistance to iocane powder?
Yes.
Okay, what does it mean?
What the question is about is that in the movie, the guy has developed an immunity by building up his tolerance.
Yes, he's poisoned both cups. The answer is it's not in one cup or the other. He's poisoned both cups and developed an immunity.
Yeah, it's sort of, I mean, it's the thinking behind homeopathy. It's the thinking a little bit behind vaccines, actually. Exposure to a thing, and obviously vaccines are different than toxins.
Sure.
They're not the same thing. The immune system is evolving in a way that typically your ability to respond to particular toxins does not. But can you build a resistance? Yeah, I mean, there are actually. This is also, I think if memory serves, part of what snake charmers do. Like, they work really hard not to get bitten, but they what?
Well, I have this little hypothesis about what snake charmers do.
Well,
it
but
involves eliminating the venom glands and or fangs.
Well, some of them claim anyway, and I have not gone back to assess the veracity of the claims, or what I think the veracity of the claims is, that they are exposing themselves to small amounts, much like with the supposed iocane powder.
I think it's bull, but I'd be fascinated to find out otherwise. I will say, I think where we land here, tell me if I've got it wrong, is many things you can build up a tolerance to. There are liable to be things that are exceptions. In fact, there almost certainly are. So iocane powder, you probably could develop an immunity, but a land war in Asia, probably not.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So don't
Never
go getting comfortable with that. Yeah.
Exactly.
Happy Easter and Passover to you both. Much love.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Here we are.
I have never understood the rituals of Easter. I just feel like I need to say that. I'm not against people having a good one. The rituals of Easter, I find kind of Alice in Wonderland like.
It's very Alice in Wonderland like. Oh, for sure. The little bunny on San Juan Island ate some from the cup that said he became a big pastel-colored, floppy-eared, egg-bearing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Do you think many people will realistically catch? I don't even know how to pronounce them because I've only read them. Is it BA.1? Is that how we pronounce it, or is it BA1? The Omicron variants. Do you know how do we say it? BA1? I don't know. Yeah. So
it's that.
Okay. Do you think many people will realistically catch BA1 and then also BA2 or XE? I feel like authorities want us to think so. Thank you.
I'm very concerned that this thing came out of a lab and therefore is not going to abide by any of the normal rules and intuitions. So
you're talking about 2+ years ago, not also maybe Omicron having come out of a separate lab.
It's not
that Omicron maybe possibly having come out of a separate lab is not required for your concern to be salient here.
Not at all. And in fact, there's a way in which the weirdness of Omicron could be also a consequence of the initial laboratory environment. Right. In other words, you do serial passage in humanized mice, it escapes into human associated mice. That's a large population. It makes changes. It returns to humans because you've increased its tropism, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But basically, my feeling is, I think I hear almost everybody trying to infer what's going to happen based on the way these things tend to behave. Mm-hmm. And the problem is,
the future won't look like the past if this is the first time ever that you've had a chimeric virus emerge globally.
It may tend to revert to a normal state.
Right.
But I believe we have done the worst thing that we could do, which is bridge a gap it would not have jumped on its own. And having done so, it is now like an invasive in Hawaii.
Yeah.
And so anyway, I'm concerned that the rules about natural immunity, as much as we saw them reflected in early phases of this, may break down. Mm-hmm. And I don't like it.
Yeah. You want to say anything more about that? Well, or
Let's put it this way. We have lots of pathogens that circulate by virtue of some interaction between the way they produce natural immunity that isn't maybe so effective and the way they change and the you keep getting colds, for example, and some of that is you getting a descendant of a pathogen you've already had, which would be better if you didn't.
Yep.
So the question is, did we fast forward the process? What did we do here? And again, I would remind people we've also talked about not only is the tropism very, very high, but the range of tissues that are impacted by this thing is also anomalously high for reasons that I believe also have to do with the laboratory origin. And so, what the hell, Anthony Fauci?
Yeah, it's really not like anything else that we've seen, that we individually have experienced, and certainly, it's not. We can talk in terms of, what's the IFR, the infection fatality rate, or the CFR compared to other coronaviruses or flu, for instance. And of course, the comparison to flu early on was much lambasted, and it wasn't really appropriate then because people were doing exactly the thing. They were conflating, like, does it have a similar effectively death rate? That's a simplification, to flu, or does it not? And given that we live with flu, what the hell, why are we shutting down things over this? That's a question that then tends to lead people to think like, well, it's the flu. Yes, I know people die of the flu, but mostly they're very old. Is that true of COVID? Yes. But if this is, as frankly all the evidence suggests it is, a lab creation, and given that it causes sets of symptoms that are not like anything else, the anosmia, the loss of smell and taste that many people experience, the lesions that some people get, the like the blisters on the, I've never seen or heard directly of anyone, but people get on like the pads of their fingers and toes. The brain fog, these aren't things that you get with a cold, with other coronaviruses. They're not things that you get with the flu, right? These aren't, these like one-off, very weird symptoms are the kinds of things you expect from the kinds of exotic tropical vector diseases, like mosquito vector diseases that we have tried to protect ourselves against in other places. So it's a weird, exotic thing that if you're just counting deaths, doesn't seem to have a very high death rate, especially if you treat for it. Yeah. But what are the long-term effects of having been exposed to it multiple times if you end up with symptoms? Like, what does it persist in tissues? Does it affect longevity? This is a question that we don't hear people talking about.
Yeah, or at least not very well. And if you take the model, I advanced back in the telomere days, which is that every disease robs you of longevity, right? Even a common cold. The point is they don't typically rob you of very much.
Yeah.
And if, let's say that we talk about every respiratory virus that you've had in your life, everyone robs you of a little bit because they take the tissues that you depend on for respiration and they cause cells to die and have to be replaced.
So the argument there, though, would be contingent on they will have robbed you of some life if it's those respiratory tissues that reach the end of their, hit their Hayflick limit at first among all of your cells. If that's the thing that takes you out.
Exactly what I'm getting at is if you take every respiratory disease that you've had and you imagine they all rob you of some longevity, but most people don't die from the failure of their lungs, then the point is you don't tend to see that effect very strongly, right? It's there. But in the case of something like SARS-CoV-2, which impacts many, many tissues, and the argument that I've put forward before is that that's because if you give this disease to a bunch of ferrets in a cage in a laboratory, they don't have to keep functioning well as ferrets in order to spread it, unlike a wild disease that has to keep its host healthy enough to succeed. So the anosmia in particular is conspicuous because a ferret that can't smell probably starves to death. So the point is, but a ferret in a cage doesn't need to smell in order to find its chow. So we may have created symptoms that wouldn't accompany an ordinary disease. But the point is, if the thing is damaging lots of tissues around the body, right, then the point is it's not like a respiratory virus where you have to ultimately die of the failure of your lungs in order to see the effect it's had on your longevity. The point is, if it's expiring, a little bit of liver, a little bit of, I don't know what tissues it's affecting, but many tissues by virtue of the way it interfaces with circulation. And the point is, well, you're going to die of the failure of one of those things, aren't you? Right? And if you do, you don't have to. Cancer is sort of the opposite of the failure of these systems, but you're very likely to die from the failure of some system, right? It's going to be something like half of deaths that are not the result of trauma.
Right.
So if that's the case, then the chances that it will have burned some of the longevity you had in that tissue are high, which means that the effect on longevity is going to be much more widespread.
Right. And that's associated with the prediction that there will be an increase in cancers across many systems.
So it also seems to be somehow liberating cancers that people had that were functioning very slowly, or things that were prototumors and things like that. So you basically have cancer and failure of an organ as opposite failure modes.
Right.
And both of these things seem to be impacted by this disease. So anyway, it's a very frightening disease. I did want to correct one thing, though. You said the loss of taste and smell. Now, absolutely people lose their sense of smell, but I think a lot of the people who say they've lost their sense of taste never had taste in the first place.
Oh, okay. I stand corrected. I was talking to a wonderful woman this week who I assure you did, and she now has it again, but did in fact lose both, and she had taste in both senses of the word.
Really?
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
That's it's like a redundant backup sense of taste.
Yeah. No, not at all. Different.
Totally different.
Same spellings.
It's spelled it.
Yep. Okay. I don't know. We got a couple questions here. We're closing in on an hour, aren't we? Okay. I don't know. Geert Vandenbush's recent warning is dire. The mass vax races are on. How to amplify this warning? I don't know what he said recently.
I haven't seen it.
Yeah. I don't know.
I think figuring out how accurate Geert has been and where he has been inaccurate is important, because a lot of what he says is highly consequential. And I think he was very right about the question of variants. I don't know if he was fully right about the consequence of the proliferation of variants. It may have been less severe in terms of its impact, which is not to say it wasn't severe. But anyway, look, I think he's done really important work. I'm proud to have put him on DarkHorse and talked about this stuff, because I think his model has been largely borne out. But in terms of a dire warning, I want to see the content and figure out, if we say, well, how accurate was he? You've got a question of kind and a question of intensity. And I think he's done better on kind than intensity, as far as I know so far. So anyway, I would. Yeah.
I guess I'm not as familiar, and it's been a while since I've thought about it, and I was not as familiar with exactly his thinking and his hypotheses, but it seems to me that the intensity part was, and he stated that it was more guesswork. That, he said, this will happen if you mass vaccinate in the middle of a pandemic. You will create variants.
Yep.
That seems to have happened.
Yep.
And then he said, and maybe in part because he's like yelling into the void and trying to get attention on something that he's really worried about, said, this is serious because here's why. And then that part, which is the intensity part of your argument, wasn't predicted inherently. That was that was guesswork. He, I think, knew that he was standing on less solid scientific ground with regard to the intensity part of the argument anyway, that was sort of a follow-on too. Like, and when that happens, here's why we should care.
Well, actually, this is, I think, philosophically important.
Yeah.
Because one who predicts for a living always has this problem. Right? Predicting what will happen is tough, but it's far easier than predicting exactly how it plays out, when exactly it plays out. So, for example, when Evergreen came apart, I very clearly said, look, this is going to spill into the world. It's going to get into the courts. It's going to get into, every
media. Yep.
Right.
Yep.
I was still shocked by how fast it went down and how quickly we got to the BLM riots and the sort of mass insanity.
Yeah.
So the point is, even somebody who sees it as clearly as anybody doesn't necessarily have the same level of resolution on when and how it's going to unfold exactly. So I do not mean in any way to detract from what Geert has done. It's just like you've got, what's going to happen is hard enough.
Yep.
How exactly it's going to happen is virtually impossible.
Yep, totally. Okay. One last question. This is nice. Heather, you're looking great. Any tips? Love you guys. I thank you for that. I've been moving a lot more. And winter's tough. Winter's always tough. And I am definitely feeling not having been in the tropics for over 2 years at this point, which just makes it, which I love and makes everything feel easy and fluid, and it's easy to move. But even with, so last week we said, wow, we had a day, now 9 days ago, it was 75 degrees here, early April. I actually went out paddleboarding for the first time this season. It was amazing. 4 days later, it was snowing enough for our wonderful house guests and their 3.5-year-old daughter, who had never before seen snow, to build a snowman on our front patio, the remnants of which still persist, even though since then it has hailed here 800 times. Like, it has hailed here so many times, so intensely. And then we had this thunderstorm just now. Like, this incredible stochasticity is worrisome for sure. Anyway, that all makes it a little bit more difficult to want to move around. But I think anyone who just does get into the habit, and presumably almost all of us have been in the habit, and if it's a sport, back when I played volleyball or ultimate, it was easier. It's like, oh, there's other people going to be there and we can have fun. It's great. And when it's biking, which both you and I have done a lot of, and you've been doing more of it lately than I have, it's a little hard to motivate because you're only letting yourself down and it's not social.
Yeah, I will also say on that front, it is easier and better to keep doing it as the weather gets rotten than to try to pick it up. And so almost every year that we have lived in this climate or worse, there's some point in the winter where you get sick, and there are weeks that you don't get on your bike, and then it's much harder to go back to. It's almost hard to remember how you do it and stay warm.
Yeah.
You either overdress and you go out and
you're sweating, and then you're clammy, and then
right,
you're right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So anyway, I think there's something, and you're making this point to trying to be consistent rather than, try to bootstrap your way back to it in the middle of the winter.
Yeah, and I guess the thing that has helped me just recently is trying to be conscious, to raise to consciousness during a day that I have been moving, and that I've been, I've also been, I really like sugar. I really like baking things, and I like eating baked goods, but I've been doing less of that. And I love the process of making goodies for people I love and for me, and eating them, but almost nothing else in the day is better. Like, nothing else in the day is better as a result. Yeah. And so bringing to consciousness in any day that I have been active and that I have only eaten delicious, nutritious food that is good for me, all the other moments actually feel better. It's easier to run up the stairs. It's easier to, not fall on a slippery deck. And being grateful, like, that's in part because I'm doing these things, and I'm more capable now, helps reinforce, like, actually, I'm not going to have that delicious cranberry almond muffin after all.
Well, okay, so this raises a point. Mm-hmm. I think one of the reasons that we all have these challenges is that when you're young, the impact of making bad decisions of this kind tends not to be significant and maybe not noticeable. So what it is that the existence of hazards that actually do have an impact, but it doesn't rise above some threshold compromising, trains you badly that these things, there are lots of people out there who talk about avoid this, avoid that, but I don't detect anything. And then at the point that you're old enough that you do start detecting that stuff, you actually have to A, work to see the pattern, and that B, you've got bad habits that you got to unlearn.
I had this problem in particular, and I can actually think of 3 ways that my body just is different now. It responds differently to things. So, as you know, in high school, the first retail job that I had was working at Baskin-Robbins.
Mm-hmm.
And we were allowed, it was totally legit, the owner of this particular shop, we were allowed to take a pint home every night. And I would take a pint home and I would eat it. And I was also playing varsity volleyball. Yep. And I was very thin and very strong. And, I had no extra weight as a result of eating that much ice cream on the regular basis, 3, 4, 5 times a week. I was eating a pint of ice cream at night and it was fine. And there's been part of me until fairly recent, it was like, why can't I just keep doing that? And I don't do that. But similarly, I just had an incredibly high tolerance for alcohol and I never burned, right?
Right.
Never. And so you watch, you're like, okay, starting around maybe when I turned 40, got my first sunburn ever, okay, that's going to be different then. Started becoming a little bit more sensitive to alcohol. Okay, can't just go out on occasion and have a bunch of drinks and expect not to have it come back to you. So, we change, our bodies change. This is part of what we argue in the book. Even if there was a best diet for all humans who were 20 years old, which there's not because the Inuit and the Maasai both exist, there can't be a best diet that is for a 2-year-old baby and a 14-year-old young man and a 25-year-old pregnant woman and a 50-year-old guy and an 80-year-old woman. Those people all have different nutritional needs and their bodies work differently, and they will do better with different diets, and they need to listen to their own feedback systems in order to figure out what to eat.
Yeah, totally agree with this. You do look great, and the point that you're making is an important one, that it's almost like an untaught life skill, just paying attention so that you can detect cause and effect.
Yeah,
is a key thing that everybody should learn, and we do a very poor job in civilization of conveying that. Well,
in part, again because of this, right? Because of what we talk about in Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, hypernovelty makes it much harder to do pattern recognition.
Yeah.
Right? There's so much more noise. That it's harder. It feels like I'm just going to give up. I'm just going to guess. And many of the systems, the biofeedback systems in our body, actually take so much time that any given day has so much noise in it, as noise compared to pattern. But add to that the fact that you might not detect even a signal in 6 weeks. Well, how are you going to tell?
Right.
You have to be very careful with yourself in order to tell for some things.
You have to become very good at, there's lots of noise. So you have to be very good at not talking yourself into something that isn't a correlation, but that you saw a connection once, effectively a superstitious level of thinking. And you have to be systematic about reducing the number of impacts of things that are impacting you in order to be able to detect the consequence of those things that you are intersecting with, which it's worth doing, but it's not easy.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, I think that brings us to the end here. We will be doing that private Q&A on our Patreons next Sunday, which is going to be April 24th at 11 a.m. Pacific for members of my Patreon. Our next public live stream is not going to be until Thursday, April 28th, and then we've got a weird schedule thereafter for a little bit. But consider joining us at our private Q&A. It's a lot of fun. We actually pay attention to the chat and get to interact a little bit. The thing I forgot to mention is that the question asking period is right now. So if you join right now, you can ask questions that we then may get to in the Q&A. I think otherwise, we're there.
I think we're there.
Until we see you next, be good to the ones you love, eat good food, and get outside.
Be well, everyone.